Welcome friends, it's Mr. Davo. Today we're going to take a look at how much dust and dirt and damage a lens can withstand before it becomes a problem. Let's jump on in. This is a video I've wanted to do for some time. Wasn't planning on doing it quite yet, and then something happened which kind of pushed me to it. This lens here, it's a Rokinon or Samyang 24mm manual focus lens. I love this lens and I use it a lot. A couple months ago I was out chasing some storms. This lens was mounted on my Canon EOS R, put on a tripod with fairly good stabilization, yet the wind took it over on the top of a hill and it went straight down right into the rocks. Now I'm grateful that the lens took the brunt of the fall and not the camera itself, but the lens got a pretty good scratch on it. Initially I thought, okay, well I'll have to buy the lens again. But then I looked at how much I paid for it. It was around $600. So I looked into how much it would be to repair it, $200 to $300. So the obvious question should be, do I really need to repair it? Is the damage that big of a deal? Well, it's certainly worth testing it to try it out. But it also brought me back to my original question that I've wondered for a long time, and that is how much dust, how much damage, how much dirt, etc. on a lens is tolerable? How much can it take before you notice it? How much is too much? So I'm going to investigate these questions in the rest of this video. Let's dive in. In the first photo, I don't really see any evidence of the damage. Second photo, pretty much the same. Third example, I still don't really see any damage. Now there's a couple of reasons for this. First is the aperture is f5.6 in all these examples, so the depth of field is not substantial. If I'd gone up to f11, f22, there's a greater chance that the damage would be noticed. The second is these pictures have a degree of complexity to them, meaning there's texture, there's objects, and that really hides damage quite well. So I think a fairer example, in fact, let's try it. Let's go take some pictures of a very clean object with no obstruction really to get in the way of where the damage might be. How about like a bright blue sky? In the first example, again, I really don't see any damage. This is f1.4. Let's go up to f11. Yep, I start to see some damage there. It's kind of a cloudy area here, and that's where the scratch is. And then if we go up to f22, which I would never use, absolutely we can see the damage on the lens right here. Now if you look a little closer, you'll also see there's spots everywhere, little tiny black dots. What's that all about? Well, that's dust on the lens. Before taking these shots, I did a quick visual examination of the lens and I didn't see any dust on it, so I went ahead and shot. But yet we see this dust. Now in fairness, it's at f22. I'm rarely going to use this lens at f22. At f11 and certainly wider, I don't see the dust at all, and even the damage is not that substantial. In fact, it's easy to argue that in Lightroom or Photoshop, I could probably edit this most of the time. And certainly once the picture becomes more complex, it's not just a bright blue sky, the damage just disappears into the picture itself. So back to the original question. Do I need to get the lens repaired? Is it necessary? And of course the answer is it totally depends on the kind of work I'm shooting. For all the work that I've shown here, unless I do a lot of clear blue sky shooting at a very high aperture, the answer is not really. But I do a lot of time-lapse work. In time-lapse work, we're taking a series of shots where the camera is essentially still and the sky or other objects move in front of it. And for me, it's landscapes, which means it's the sky. So any flaws in the sky have to be edited out frame by frame if I'm not to see them visibly in front of the moving background of the clouds itself. And with damage like this, it's just simply not practical to edit it out. So for the time-lapse work I do, there's just no way. I have to have this lens repaired. So let's jump back to the earlier question about how much dust and dirt and damage a lens can take before it's noticeable, but not using a lens like this, a specialty lens, which has some pretty unique properties. How about a lens like this one, Canon 18 to 55 kit lens that many people would have, or some equivalent of this. Let's see how much it would take for this lens to show these kinds of problems in a way that's noticeable. Let's start first with just dust on the lens. This is pretty typical. Now, if I saw this much dust on my lens, I'd absolutely want to clean it off. But again, the question is, should I? In the first photo at f3.5, I don't see any dust at all. Let's push that up to f5.6. I still don't see any dust. Now I could push it further, but this lens, I'm typically not going to be shooting it a lot higher than that. So the truth is, I just don't think this dust is really going to be visible. So then I'm thinking, okay, dust is one thing. How about like a gross fingerprint? There's no way that we won't see this in the final images. Here we are again at f3.5, nothing. f5.6, nothing. What's it going to take for us to see something that we've done to this lens in the photos? So next I figured, let's add a simulated scratch. I mean, who wants to scratch the lens, right? So let's take a thin piece of soap and try to simulate a scratch or something like that, some damage to the lens. Well, let's look at the results. f3.5, I don't see anything. f5.6, nothing. This is getting frustrating. How about f11? And now I start to see something down near the bottom, some darker wavy kind of lines. That's certainly the simulated damage. But again, most of the time in most photos, this will just blend into the picture and you're not going to see it. So at this point, I'm actually a little frustrated. I really thought some of that would have shown up a lot more than it did, especially on that clear blue sky. So let's get real. How do most people truly damage their lenses? Well, they drop them. It's not too often that you take a knife or something and accidentally scratch the front of your lens. It's through dropping it that it's likely to happen. Now, do I really want to take this lens and drop it, which is irrevocably going to damage it? Well, here's the thing. This lens, the autofocus is broken, doesn't work at all, and the stabilizer is broken on it, and it's a cheap kit lens. So I don't feel too bad about damaging this lens. So let's go out and drop it. So I did a few tests and I dropped it into the gravel. And you know what? Aside from breakage around the edge, around the rim of the lens itself, the plastic, the lens barely got any scratches on it. Nothing worse than I'd done already. So it was time to really amp the game up. In the parking lot, I dropped it straight onto some concrete, bound to do some damage to it. Oh yeah, we got some damage all right. This is about 10 times the damage to the Samyang 24mm lens. But I guess the proof's in the pudding. Can we see it? All right, f3.5. Do I see the damage? No and yes. So I don't see any of the damage in the sky at all. But look at the ground. On the left side of the photo, it's totally out of focus. Middle of the photo, it's in focus. The right side, it isn't. So even though the damage to the lens's surface isn't visible, I've done something really bad inside the lens itself. I think some of the glass has become misaligned and it can't quite focus as good as it should. So the lens is absolutely ruined at this point, but that's not what I'm really trying to get at. I'm looking at damage to the surface of a lens and can it be seen? And I'm going to say no. f5.6, I still don't see it. I can't believe this. f11, yep, now I start to see it. It's not terrible and it could easily be hidden in many pictures, but it is here. And to push the point, f22, absolutely I can see the damage. There's no denying it at all. But of course I can't stop there. I can see that the damage is visible. My real question at this point, now that I've gone this far already, is when is the damage always unavoidable? So I thought, let's take the lens and let's, instead of dropping it, because the truth is I had to drop it so many times to get damage to start showing up, let's just grab it and just drive it straight into the gravel by hand. Something that's just kind of can't miss it. Well, I did so, and the results are that the lens, well, it caved in on itself. There is absolutely no way this lens can ever be used again for any purpose, although very interestingly, the electronics still work fine. I can still control the aperture, the camera can still read what the lens is. It's kind of surprising how much damage it took, and yet in some ways parts of it still work. What is my conclusion? Well, unless the dust is pretty severe, or the fingerprints, etc., and I know the conditions I'm going to be shooting in, very high aperture, clean blue skies, etc., I suggest just leave it on there. Every time you clean your lens, you risk damaging it. I've got a Rokinon or Samyang 14mm lens here. I had another one of these, an earlier one, that got damaged in a storm as well. But before that, I noticed one day while I was out chasing storms that it looked dusty and kind of dirty. And this lens, which I do shoot at higher apertures, it really shows up the dust very, very quickly, especially in time lapses. So I knew I had to clean it. I blew most of the dust off with a blower first of all, then took a cloth and very carefully cleaned it. Yet at the end of that, I still had dragged 3 scratches across the surface. Now, most of the time they didn't show up in most pictures, but it still just drove me crazy that I put them there, even though I was so very careful. And this is such a contrast to what I think most people believe about their lenses. Clean them, clean them, clean them. It's really not the case with DSLR lenses. Leave them alone, leave them alone. Don't risk damaging them. So the Samyang 24mm must go in for repairs, no avoiding it. Let's pack it up, let's ship it off, and hope it comes back soon. Thanks for watching. Let me know if you liked the video, consider subscribing, and click the bell if you want to be notified of new content. As always, be safe and be kind.